There is something about the way evening settles over these mountains that makes a person want to tell the truth. The light goes soft and golden, filtering through the Douglas firs until everything takes on that amber quality that seems to belong to memory rather than the present moment. The birds grow quiet one by one, and the forest begins its long exhale into darkness. And somewhere in that transition between day and night, the boundaries of what can be spoken aloud seem to thin and become permeable. I am an old man now. My name is Thomas Ashford, and I have lived in these woods, on and off, for the better part of 5 decades. The cabin behind me was built by my grandfather when this country was still wild in ways it no longer remembers, and the porch where I sit has held 3 generations of my family as they watch the same mountains turn purple in the fading light. I have sat here through more evenings than I could possibly count, but tonight feels different. Tonight, after all these years of keeping silent, I find that I'm finally ready to speak. What I'm about to share with you is not a story I have ever told before, not to colleagues or friends, not to the few family members who remain, not to anyone. For decades, I have carried it quietly, the way you carry something precious and fragile that you fear might break if exposed to too much light. But I'm old enough now to understand that some stories do not belong to the people who lived them. Some stories belong to the world, and the act of keeping them hidden becomes its own kind of betrayal. So I offer this to you now, in the gathering darkness, with the scent of cedar and moss rising from the forest floor and the first stars beginning to show themselves above the ridgeline. I offer it not as proof of anything, for I have no proof to give, but as testimony, as witness, as the only record that will remain of something extraordinary that happened in these mountains, something that changed everything I thought I understood about the world, about loneliness, about what it truly means to belong. Listen, if you will. Let the night settle around you, and I will tell you about the 12 years I spent in the company of those who are not supposed to exist. In the years before the forest claimed me, I lived what most people would consider an enviable life. I had built a career as a wildlife biologist, spending my days in the field studying the movement patterns of elk herds and the nesting habits of spotted owls, documenting the slow recovery of wolf populations in regions where they had been absent for generations. It was work that suited me deeply, this patient observation of creatures who lived by rhythms older than human memory, and I was good at it in the way that people are good at things they were perhaps born to do. I had a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town, close enough to the mountains that I could see them from my kitchen window, close enough to the forest that deer sometimes wandered through my yard in the early morning hours. I had a wife named Catherine who taught elementary school and laughed easily and could identify more wildflowers by their Latin names than anyone I had ever met. And I had a daughter, Emma, who was 7 years old and already developing her own love for the natural world, who would sit beside me on weekend mornings with her own small pair of binoculars and ask me questions about every bird and butterfly that crossed our path. They were the center of everything. Catherine, with her warmth and her patience and her way of making even ordinary moments feel like small celebrations. Emma, with her boundless curiosity and her gap-toothed smile and her absolute conviction that her father knew the answer to every question in the universe. Our life together was not extraordinary in any outward sense, but it was full in the way that matters most, full of presence and attention and the quiet daily acts of love that accumulate over years until they become the very substance of a person's existence. I tell you this not to dwell on what was lost, but so that you might understand the shape of the emptiness that followed, so that you might comprehend how a man who had lived so fully could become so hollow, and why the forest, when I finally fled to it, felt less like escape than like the only place left where I could possibly survive. The accident happened on a November evening when the first real cold of winter had begun to settle over the region. I was not there. I've spent years being grateful that I was not there, and other years being tortured by the same fact. Catherine and Emma were driving home from a school event, a fall concert where Emma had sung with her second-grade class, and the roads were slick with black ice that had formed during the hour they were inside the warm auditorium. The details do not matter now, and I will not share them. What matters is that in a single moment, while I was at home preparing dinner and listening to the radio and existing in a world that still made sense, The two people who gave my life its meaning were taken from it. The months that followed are difficult to describe, and I will not burden you with their full weight. Grief is a country with its own geography, its own laws of physics, its own distorted passage of time, and those who have traveled there will understand without explanation, while those who have not could never truly comprehend no matter how many words I used. What I can tell you is that I went through the motions of living without any sense of actually being alive. I returned to work because the alternative was to sit alone in a house full of their absence. I ate because the body demands fuel, whether the spirit wants it or not. I slept when exhaustion finally overcame me and lay awake through long hours when it did not. The house became unbearable. Every room held memories that had transformed from treasures into torments. Catherine's reading. Glasses still sat on her nightstand. Emma's drawing still covered the refrigerator door. The silence where their voices should have been was so loud, it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. Friends tried to help, colleagues expressed their sympathy, but I could not receive what they offered. I was too hollowed out to hold anything. It was my supervisor who finally suggested the leave of absence. He could see that I was diminishing, that the work I had once loved was now just another form of going through motions, and he offered the time gently, without pressure. "Take as long as you need," he said. "The forest will still be here when you are ready to return." I did not know then if I would ever be ready, or if ready was even a state I could imagine reaching. But I accepted the leave, because I had run out of alternatives, because staying in that town with its memories and its well-meaning sympathy had become impossible, and because there was one place left that had always felt like sanctuary, one place where the noise of human concern could not reach me, one place wild enough to hold the enormity of what I was carrying. My grandfather's cabin sat deep in the Olympic Peninsula, in a stretch of forest so remote that reaching it required hours of driving on progressively worse roads, followed by a 2-mile hike along a trail that had long since begun surrendering to the undergrowth. The cabin itself was modest, built from timber my grandfather had harvested from the surrounding forest, equipped with a wood stove for heat and an ancient hand pump for water, and nothing else that the modern world might consider necessary. My family had used it occasionally over the years, but I had not been there since before Emma was born, since before my life had taken the shape that was now shattered. I arrived in late winter, when snow still lay heavy on the higher elevations, and the forest dripped with moisture from the constant mist that moved through the valleys. I had brought enough supplies to last several months, and I had told no one exactly where I was going or how long I intended to stay. I was not thinking clearly enough to plan beyond the next day. I was simply running, the way an injured animal runs, seeking darkness and solitude and whatever approximation of peace might exist in a world that had proven itself capable of such cruelty. The cabin was cold and musty when I unlocked the door for the first time in nearly a decade. Mouse droppings littered the floor, and a family of squirrels had made a nest in one corner of the roof space, and the wood stove was rusted from years of disuse. I spent the first days simply making the place habitable, splitting firewood and clearing debris and patching the most obvious gaps in the walls, and there was a kind of mercy in this physical labor. My hands could stay busy even when my mind could not find purchase on anything resembling hope. I had not come here with any intention beyond survival. I did not expect the forest to heal me or teach me or transform my grief into something bearable. I expected nothing at all, which was perhaps the only expectation I was capable of holding. I simply needed to be somewhere that was not the house where we had been a family, somewhere that did not require me to perform normalcy for people who wanted to help but could not possibly understand. I needed to be alone in a way that the human world could not provide. And so I settled into that cabin in the deep woods, with the rain pattering on the roof and the ancient trees standing silent all around me, and I began what I thought would be a season of waiting out my grief until I could decide whether I wanted to continue living at all. I had no way of knowing that the forest had other plans for me. I had no way of knowing that I was not nearly as alone as I believed. Those first months in the wilderness passed in a kind of blur, the days bleeding into one another without clear boundaries, marked only by the most basic rhythms of survival. I woke when the light through the small windows grew strong enough to penetrate my sleep. I built fires and heated water and prepared simple meals that I ate without tasting. I split wood because the stove consumed it endlessly, and the cold was unforgiving. I walked the trails my grandfather had cut through the forest decades ago, not for pleasure or exercise, but simply because movement was easier than stillness, because when I was walking, I did not have to decide what to do next. The grief did not lift. I had not expected it to, and I would have mistrusted any quick relief. But it changed shape in the silence of the forest, becoming less sharp and more pervasive, less like a wound and more like a climate. In the world I had left behind, grief had been something I carried alongside other things, a burden I bore while still going through the motions of ordinary life. Here, with nothing to distract me and no one to perform for, grief became the medium I lived in, the air I breathed, the water I moved through. It was everywhere and constant, and paradoxically, that constancy made it easier to bear. I did not have to keep picking it up and putting it down. I could simply exist within it and let it be what it was. The forest asked nothing of me. This was perhaps the greatest mercy of those early months. The trees did not require me to explain how I was feeling or to make progress toward some imagined recovery. The rain fell without caring whether I noticed it or not. The creek that ran past the cabin continued its patient journey toward the sea regardless of whether I stood on its banks or remained inside by the fire. There was a profound indifference in the natural world that I found strangely comforting, a reminder that my pain, however vast it felt from the inside, was a small thing in the larger pattern of existence. Slowly, so slowly that I could not have identified when it began, I started to notice things beyond my own suffering. The way the light changed as winter reluctantly loosened its grip on the mountains. The particular quality of silence that descended when snow was falling, a hush so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. The calls of birds returning from their southern migrations, tentative at first and then growing more confident as the days lengthened. I'd spent my career studying wildlife, but I'd always done so with purpose, with questions to answer and data to collect. Now, I watched without agenda, simply because watching gave my eyes somewhere to rest. The forest around the cabin was old in a way that defied casual comprehension. These were not the managed woodlands of tree farms or the recovering second growth that covered most of the region. These were ancient trees, some of them 500 years old or more, their trunks so massive that I could not have wrapped my arms around them, even with several people helping. Western red cedars with their fibrous bark and their cathedral-like canopies, Sitka spruces that climbed toward the pale sky like green spires, Douglas firs that had been saplings when European ships first arrived on these shores. The forest floor was carpeted with moss so thick and soft it felt like walking on cushions, and ferns grew in profusion wherever enough light filtered through the canopy to sustain them. I learned the land the way a person learns a new language, slowly and with many mistakes, building vocabulary one word at a time. I discovered where the elk came to graze in the early morning hours, a meadow about a mile from the cabin where the grass grew lush and the tree cover provided quick escape routes in all directions. I found the places where black bears had left their marks on trees, scratches and rubbings that told stories of territory and hierarchy that I could only partially read. I located the den of a family of river otters who lived along the creek, and I would sometimes sit on a boulder upstream and watch them play in the cold water, their joy so uncomplicated and complete that it made my chest ache with something that was not quite sorrow. The rhythms of the forest became my rhythms. I rose with the dawn, not because I chose to, but because the light and the sounds of the waking world pulled me from sleep. I moved through the trails during the hours when animals were most active, early morning and late evening, and I rested during the quiet midday when even the birds seemed to pause. I began to notice patterns I had never attended to before, the way certain plants bloomed in sequence as the season progressed, the way the deer mice and voles moved through the underbrush in predictable waves of activity, the way weather announced itself hours in advance through subtle changes in wind and cloud and the behavior of creatures who read the sky with senses I could only imagine. It was during one of my early morning walks, perhaps 2 months after I had arrived, that I first noticed something I could not explain. I'd been following a game trail that wound along the creek, moving quietly out of habit and instinct, when I came upon a stretch of muddy bank where animals often came to drink. The tracks in the mud told the usual stories. Deer had been here, and a raccoon, and what looked like a large dog, though there were no dogs within miles of this place. But among these familiar marks was something else, something that stopped me in my tracks and held me there for a long time. The print was human-like in its general shape, with a clear heel and toe impressions, but it was far larger than any human foot I had ever seen. Nearly twice the length of my own boot print, and proportionally wider, pressed deep into the mud with a weight that suggested something massive. I knelt beside it, my training taking over despite my addled state, and I studied it with the careful attention I had once given to wolf tracks and bear scat. The toes were distinct, 5 of them, but they were arranged differently than a human foot, more splayed, more adapted for gripping uneven terrain. And the print was fresh, made within the last few hours, the edges still sharp and unweathered. I should have been frightened perhaps, or at least unsettled. A wildlife biologist encountering evidence of an animal that was not supposed to exist should have felt something like alarm. But I was too hollowed out for fear, too emptied by grief to summon the energy for any strong emotion. What I felt instead was curiosity, a faint stirring of something that had been dormant since that November evening when my world had ended. For the first time in months, I found myself genuinely interested in something outside my own pain. I looked up from the print and scanned the forest around me, seeing it differently now, as if a filter had been removed. The trees stood silent and watchful. The creek continued its gentle murmuring. Nothing moved in the underbrush, and yet I had the sudden distinct impression that I was being observed, that somewhere in the green depths of the forest, eyes were watching me with the same careful attention I had just given to that impossible footprint. The feeling was not threatening. This is important to understand, and it is difficult to explain to someone who was not there. Whatever was watching me, if indeed anything was watching me at all, did not feel predatory or hostile. It felt more like the way a wild animal watches a newcomer in its territory, assessing, evaluating, waiting to see what this strange being would do. I had been that watcher many times in my career, observing wolves and bears and mountain lions from a careful distance while they went about their lives, and I recognized the quality of that attention even when I could not see its source. I stood slowly, making no sudden movements, and I spoke aloud for the first time in weeks. My voice sounded strange in the forest quiet, rusty from disuse. "I am not here to cause harm," I said, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. "I am just trying to survive, same as you." There was no response, of course. The forest held its breath for a long moment, and then somewhere in the distance, a raven called and the spell was broken. I turned and made my way back to the cabin, my mind working in ways it had not worked for months, turning over possibilities and questions like stones in a stream bed. In the days that followed, I began to notice other signs, disturbances in the underbrush that did not match the patterns of any animal I knew. Branches broken at heights no deer could reach and no bear would bother with, small piles of stones in places where stones had no natural reason to be, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. And twice more I found those massive footprints, always near water, always fresh, always appearing in places I had walked just hours before. I started keeping a journal again, something I had not done since before the accident. I documented what I found, with the careful precision of my training, measuring and sketching and noting the location and conditions of each discovery. I did not know what I was documenting or whether it would ever matter to anyone. I only knew that the act of observation, of paying attention to something beyond my own grief, was pulling me back toward the surface of life, inch by careful inch. The forest had given me a mystery, and mysteries require presence. They require attention. They require the observer to remain alive and alert and engaged with the world, if only to see what happens next. And so, without fully realizing what was happening, I began to choose life again, not because my grief had lifted, but because something in those ancient woods was reaching toward me, and I found that I wanted to know what it was. The meadow where I first saw him clearly had become my morning sanctuary in the weeks following my discovery of those impossible footprints. It lay about a mile from the cabin, accessible by a trail that wound through old-growth forest before opening into a natural clearing perhaps 200 yards across. A creek bordered one edge, its gentle voice a constant presence, and the grass grew thick and lush from the moisture that collected in this low-lying space. Elk came here to graze in the hours just after dawn, and I had fallen into the habit of arriving before first light to sit motionless on a fallen log at the meadow's edge, watching the slow ritual of their feeding as the forest woke around me. I had learned to be still in a way I had never quite mastered before. Stillness had always been a tool in my work, a technique for getting close to animals who would flee from noise and movement. But now it had become something else, a discipline that asked nothing of me except presence, a way of being in the world that required no decisions and carried no weight of the past or future. I would sit on that log as the darkness thinned to gray, and the first birds began their tentative morning songs, and I would empty myself of everything except the simple act of watching. It was, I think, a form of meditation, though I would not have called it that at the time. It was simply the only way I knew to exist without being crushed by my own thoughts. On the morning everything changed. The meadow was wrapped in mist. This was not unusual for the season. Spring had fully arrived by then, and the warming days drew moisture from the sodden earth, creating fog that pooled in the low places and drifted between the trees like something alive and searching. I had arrived at my usual time, picking my way along the trail by memory and the faintest suggestion of pre-dawn light, and I had settled onto my log to wait for whatever the morning might offer. The elk had not yet appeared, but I could hear them moving in the forest to the south, their soft sounds carrying through the quiet air. The mist made the world feel smaller, more intimate. I could see perhaps 50 yards in any direction before the gray curtain swallowed everything, and this limited visibility created a strange sense of enclosure, as if the meadow had become a room with walls of vapor. The grass was heavy with dew, and the creek's voice seemed louder in the dampened air, and I sat in that gentle cocoon of fog and half-light and felt for the first time in many months something approaching peace. I do not know how long I sat there before I became aware that something had changed. It was not a sound that alerted me or a movement, but rather a quality of attention in the forest itself. The birds had gone quiet, I realized, not in the sudden frightened way they do when a predator appears, but gradually, as if they were holding their breath in anticipation of something. The elk, too, had stopped their movement through the underbrush. The only sound was the creek, and my own heartbeat, and even these seemed muffled, subordinate to a larger silence that had descended over the meadow like a soft blanket. I remained still. Whatever was happening, I understood intuitively that stillness was the only appropriate response. I had spent enough time in the wild to know that some moments require surrender, that there are forces in the forest older and wiser than any human knowledge, and that the proper posture in their presence is one of humility and patience. So I sat on my log with my hands resting on my knees, and my breath coming slow and even, and I waited. The figure emerged from the mist so gradually that I could not have said when I first became certain I was seeing it. One moment, there was only the gray curtain of fog at the far edge of the meadow. The next, there was a shape within that grayness, a vertical darkness that might have been a tree trunk or a trick of the light. And then, step by slow step, it moved forward into visibility, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall, taller than any human I had ever encountered, perhaps 7.5 feet when he finally stood fully upright at the edge of the tree line. His body was covered in hair that was dark brown across most of his form, but lighter around the face and chest, and this hair had begun to show the silver of age, especially around his temples and shoulders. His build was massive, heavily muscled in a way that spoke of a life lived entirely in the physical world, but he moved with a grace that seemed almost impossible for a creature of such size. Each step was deliberate and controlled, placing his enormous feet with a precision that barely disturbed the dew-laden grass. His face was the most striking thing. It was not the face of an ape, not really, though I could see the kinship with our primate cousins in the heavy brow ridge and the shape of the jaw. But there was something else there, something that went beyond any animal I had ever studied. His eyes were dark and deep-set, and when they found me across that misty meadow, I felt the full weight of an intelligence that was different from human intelligence, but no less profound. Those eyes held knowledge. They held experience. They held, I would come to understand, a wisdom that had been accumulating long before the first European ships arrived on these shores. We looked at each other across the space of the meadow, perhaps 60 yards between us. The mist drifted and curled around his massive form, and neither of us moved. And in that stretched moment, I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental assumption about the world cracking open to reveal a larger and stranger truth beneath. I had spent my career studying wildlife, cataloging species, believing that I understood the boundaries of what existed in these forests. In an instant, all of that certainty dissolved like the fog that was even now beginning to thin as the sun rose higher. I should have felt fear. This is what I have thought about many times in the years since. By any rational measure, I should have been terrified. A creature of unknown nature, larger and stronger than any human, standing before me in the wilderness far from any help. Every survival instinct should have been screaming at me to run, to hide, to make myself as small and unthreatening as possible. But fear was not what I felt. What I felt was recognition, though I could not have said what I was recognizing. What I felt was the kind of awe that drops a person to their knees, though I remained seated on my log, too transfixed to move. He took another step forward, and then another, and I could see more details now as the mist continued to lift. The way his chest rose and fell with breathing that seemed impossibly slow and even. The gray in his hair that spoke of many years lived, many seasons survived. The scars on his forearms and shoulders that told stories I could not read. He was old, I realized, or at least no longer young, and there was a weariness in his posture that I understood intimately, the weight of accumulated experience pressing down on a body that had carried it for a long time. He stopped about 40 yards away, still watching me, and I understood that he was giving me the opportunity to flee. He was offering me the choice that any wild creature offers when it encounters something unknown. You may go if you wish, and I will not pursue. I felt this offer in my bones, felt the easy path it represented, the return to a world where I could convince myself that this morning had been a dream or a hallucination or a symptom of my grief-addled mind. I could walk back to the cabin and pack my things and leave these woods and never speak of what I had seen. And in time, it would fade to uncertainty, and I would be able to believe again in the small, bounded world I had inhabited before. But I did not want that. I discovered this about myself in the space of a single breath. Whatever I had lost, whatever had been taken from me, there was still something in me that reached toward mystery rather than retreating from it. There was still a capacity for wonder that grief had not entirely extinguished. And so, instead of standing and backing away, I did something that surprised me even as I did it. I raised my hand slowly, palm open and facing toward him, the most universal gesture of peaceful intent I could think of. He watched my raised hand for a long moment. The meadow was utterly silent now, even the creek seeming to hold its voice. And then, with a deliberation that made it clear this was no mimicry, no automatic response, he raised his own hand in return. His palm was enormous, broader than my chest, covered in thick skin the color of weathered leather. He held it up for several heartbeats, matching my gesture, and in that exchange, something was sealed between us, some contract written in a language older than words. Then he lowered his hand and turned, and without hurry he walked back into the trees. But before he disappeared entirely into the green depths of the forest, he paused and looked back at me over his shoulder. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to understand that this was not an ending but a beginning, that I had been seen and evaluated and not found wanting, that something had opened between us that would not easily close again. I sat on that log for hours after he vanished. The mist burned away, and the elk eventually appeared and grazed as they always did, unaware or unconcerned with what had just transpired. The birds resumed their songs and the forest went on with its ancient business, and I remained there, motionless, feeling the shape of my life rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. When I finally walked back to the cabin, the world looked different to me. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper, the forest more alive with presences I had not allowed myself to perceive before. I understood that I had been given something precious, something that came with responsibilities I could not yet fully comprehend. I understood that my season of solitary grief was transforming into something else, something I had no name for and could not predict. That night, for the first time since the accident, I slept without dreams of what I had lost. Instead, I dreamed of the forest, and of ancient eyes watching from the mist, and of a hand raised in greeting across the gulf between worlds. In the days following that first clear encounter, I found myself approaching the forest with an attention I had not felt since I was a young student just beginning to learn the craft of wildlife observation. Every walk became a study, every moment in the meadow an opportunity for communication across the vast gulf that separated our kinds. I did not rush. Some instinct deeper than thought told me that patience would be the only currency accepted in this exchange, that whatever relationship might develop would grow at its own pace or not at all. I began leaving offerings at the edge of the meadow, near the place where he had emerged from the mist. This was not a decision I made consciously, so much as something that arose naturally from my training and my intuition. Food sharing is one of the oldest forms of communication between beings, a gesture that transcends language and culture, and even species. I had seen it work with wolves I had studied years before, the slow building of trust through consistent provision, and though I did not presume to understand what I was dealing with now, the principle seemed sound. The first offering was simple. 3 apples from the small store I had brought with me to the cabin, placed on a flat stone that jutted from the earth like a natural altar. I arranged them carefully, spacing them evenly, and then I withdrew to the far side of the meadow and settled onto my usual log to wait. The morning passed without incident. The apples sat untouched as the sun climbed higher, and the elk came to graze and eventually departed. By afternoon, I'd begun to wonder if I had misread the entire encounter, if the hand raised in greeting had meant something different to him than it had to me. But when I returned to the meadow the following morning, the apples were gone. In their place, resting on that same flat stone, was a single feather. It was enormous, nearly as long as my forearm, with barring that identified it as coming from a great horned owl. I picked it up with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the profound significance of what this simple exchange represented. He had taken what I offered. He had left something in return. Communication had begun. Over the weeks that followed, the offerings and responses continued. I left whatever I could spare from my supplies: dried fish, nuts and berries I gathered from the forest, bread I baked clumsily in a cast iron pan over the wood stove. Sometimes I left things that were not food at all, objects that seemed to carry meaning. A small wooden bowl my grandfather had carved decades ago, a piece of quartz I found in the creek bed, its surface catching the light in ways that seemed almost magical. A length of rope that might prove useful for purposes I could not imagine. The responses were equally varied and increasingly personal. More feathers appeared from species I recognized, and some I did not. Unusual stones, polished by water or time, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate. Once, a bundle of herbs tied with plant fibers, releasing a fragrance when I held them close that was earthy and complex and unlike anything I could identify. Each exchange felt like a sentence in a conversation we were slowly learning to have, a vocabulary building word by careful word. I did not see him during these weeks of offering, though I felt his presence often. That quality of attention I had noticed before became familiar to me, the sensation of being watched by eyes I could not locate. I learned to recognize when he was near by the behavior of the forest itself, the particular quality of silence that descended when he approached, the way certain birds would fall quiet, while others seemed to announce his passage with calls that might have been warnings or greetings or something else entirely. The breakthrough came on a morning when late spring was beginning to shade toward summer. I had arrived at the meadow before dawn as usual and had placed my offering, a portion of smoked salmon. I'd prepared myself using techniques I half remembered from childhood camping trips with my father. The scent of it was strong and rich, and I had wondered as I set it down whether it might be too much, too aggressive an enticement. But it was what I had, and the relationship we were building seemed strong enough to risk a misstep. I had settled onto my log and was watching the eastern sky lighten when I became aware that I was no longer alone. The feeling crept over me gradually, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense of weight in the air to my left. I turned my head slowly, the way I had learned to do when observing skittish animals, moving by degrees so small they barely registered as movement at all. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 30 yards away, closer than he had ever allowed himself to be while I was present. The early light caught the silver in his hair and made his eyes gleam with reflected sky. He was watching me with that penetrating attention I was beginning to know well, and there was something different in his posture this morning, something less guarded, more open. I remained still, barely breathing, not wanting to break the spell. Minutes passed. The light strengthened, painting the meadow in gold and green. And then, with movements so slow they seemed ceremonial, he began to approach. Each step sent a shock through my system, though I kept motionless. 20 yards, 15, 10. I could see the texture of his hair now, the scars that spoke of old wounds survived, the depth of those dark eyes, and the layers of intelligence behind them. He stopped about 5 yards away, close enough that I could hear his breathing, slow and deep and remarkably quiet for a creature of such size. We looked at each other in the growing light, and I felt the weight of this moment, the significance of what he was choosing to risk. This was not casual curiosity. This was an extension of trust I must not betray. Slowly, I reached into my pouch and drew out a handful of hazelnuts. I extended my arm, palm up. He regarded my offering, then with impossible gentleness, reached out and took them. His fingers were enormous, covered in rough skin that felt like warm leather against my own. The contact lasted only seconds, but it sent a current through me. I had touched something impossible. Something impossible had chosen to touch me. He ate the hazelnuts one by one, his dark eyes never leaving my face. Then he reached into the longer hair along his forearm and produced something that glinted in the morning light. He extended his hand, and I opened my palm to receive his gift. It was a small crystal, pale pink and perfectly formed, worn smooth by years of handling. I looked up and nodded, not trusting my voice, and he made that rumbling sound again. I understood that we had crossed a threshold together. The meetings became regular after that morning, though I could not predict when they would occur. Sometimes he would be there. Sometimes I would wait for hours and see nothing. I learned not to feel disappointed. This relationship would not conform to my expectations. It would unfold according to rhythms I could only gradually learn to read. We developed a vocabulary of gesture and sound, simple at first and growing more complex. A raised hand remained our greeting. A palm pressed downward meant stay. A circular motion meant come. A particular sound he made, between a hum and a growl, indicated approval, and I learned to make something similar in response. I began to understand the protocols governing his approach. He would not come close if I was standing, only when seated. He would not approach if I had anything that might be mistaken for a weapon. He would not remain if I made sudden movements. In return, I learned his signals of mood and intent, the way his hair rose when alert, the subtle shifts in posture, the sounds with consistent meanings. He was teaching me, just as surely as I was learning. He was meeting me halfway across the gulf between our kinds. As spring deepened into summer, I found that my grief had been joined by something else. Purpose, wonder, the engagement with life that comes from having something to care about. I'd come to this forest to die, or at least to decide whether I wanted to continue living. The forest had other ideas. It had given me a reason to stay, a mystery to explore, a relationship that demanded my full presence. The understanding that he was not alone came gradually. I had assumed I was building a relationship with a solitary creature, perhaps the last, of his kind. But as summer ripened and my trust with him deepened, I began to notice signs pointing toward a different truth. It started with sounds. On evenings when I sat on the cabin porch, I would hear vocalizations drifting from the higher ridges, calls similar to his but different in pitch. These were responses, conversations, calls going out and answers coming back from different locations. He was not alone. Then came the tracks. One morning, I discovered a second set of prints alongside his, smaller by a third, suggesting someone perhaps 6 feet tall. These tracks followed his path with precision, someone who knew exactly where he was going. The first time I saw her, I was not supposed to. The mist was thick that morning, and I had settled into my usual position, assuming I was alone. Movement at the edge of my vision made me turn. The figure that materialized was different, shorter, slighter, hair more auburn than brown. She stood at the tree line for only seconds, her dark eyes finding me through the mist with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then, she was gone. When he arrived later, I tried to communicate what I had witnessed. He watched my efforts, then made a sound like acknowledgement mixed with something else. He turned and looked toward the exact spot where she had stood. He had always known I would eventually become aware of others. He had simply been waiting. Over the following weeks, he began to show me. He would lead me to vantage points from which I could observe figures in the distant trees, too far to see clearly but close enough to confirm their existence. He would bring me to places where signs of multiple individuals were unmistakable. Sleeping areas pressed down by several bodies, feeding sites harvested by more than one set of hands. The family consisted of 6 individuals. He was the eldest, the patriarch. The female I had glimpsed was his mate, and she remained wary of me far longer than he had, watching from distances, never approaching. There were 2 adolescents, bolder than the adults, more curious. The male seemed particularly fascinated, creeping closer during our sessions, until his father made a sound that meant, "Stay back." The 5th was an elder female, hair gone almost white, who moved more slowly and was treated with deference that spoke of respect earned over many years. Her role seemed advisory, a keeper of knowledge. The 6th was the youngest, born during my second summer. I learned of the pregnancy through changes in their behavior, a new protectiveness, a reluctance to range far. The elder male stopped meeting me for nearly 2 months. When he returned, he seemed preoccupied by concerns that had nothing to do with me. The birth happened somewhere I was not permitted to see, but I heard it. A night of sounds that seemed different from anything before, calls that might have been encouragement or pain or triumph. The following morning, the forest felt charged with something new. I did not see the infant for many months. The family closed ranks, protective in ways beyond any animal species I had observed. I respected their need for privacy, maintaining my routine but not pressing. Trust could not be rushed. When I was finally allowed to see the child, it was a gift I understood to be profound. The elder male led me to a spot overlooking a clearing where the family had gathered. The mother sat with her back against a massive cedar, and in her arms was the smallest being I had ever seen of their kind, perhaps the size of a human 2-year-old, but clearly younger, covered in downy hair with eyes enormous in its small face. The mother looked up and saw me watching. For a long moment, her eyes held mine. She was allowing a creature from a species that had given her kind every reason to hide and fear to look upon what she loved most. I dipped my head in acknowledgement, and she returned the gesture. The elder male made a sound beside me. "Family," he seemed to say. "This is my family. I am showing you what I love." I realized our relationship had shifted into something deeper. I had become something like a friend, someone deemed worthy of knowing the things that mattered most. I watched them through that long afternoon as they rested and played. The adolescents entertained the infant, provoking what I could only describe as laughter, so much like a human baby's giggling that it made my chest ache. The elder female watched with an expression holding both joy and sorrow. The mother held her child with devotion, needing no translation. And the elder male sat beside me, watching his family, occasionally making sounds I could not fully understand, but that communicated something essential. This is what we are. This is what we protect. This is why we hide. This is what we have to lose. I stayed until the light faded, until the family moved off toward wherever they slept, a location still unknown to me. When they were gone, I made my way back to the cabin, my heart full of something I had not felt in a very long time. I'd been allowed into a sacred space. I'd been trusted with knowledge of lives depending on remaining hidden. I'd been given membership, however provisional, in a family not my own. That night, sitting on my porch as stars emerged above the mountains, I thought about Catherine and Emma for the first time in months without grief's sharp edges cutting me open. I thought about what it meant to have a family, to belong to others, and have them belong to you. I had lost that once, so completely that I had wanted to stop existing. But here, among beings who should not exist, and yet so clearly did, I was finding my way back toward something like belonging, something like purpose, something like home. The elder male became my teacher in ways I had not anticipated and could not have requested. Our meetings shifted gradually from simple exchanges of gifts and gestures into something more purposeful, sessions where he seemed to be consciously imparting knowledge that he wanted me to understand. I do not know what prompted this change in our relationship. Perhaps he had observed me long enough to determine that I was capable of learning. Perhaps he recognized something in my patient attention that suggested I might be worthy of deeper instruction. Or perhaps, in ways I could never fully comprehend, he simply decided that it was time. The lessons began with sound. I had always known that their vocalizations carried meaning, but I had assumed this meaning was emotional rather than specific, expressions of mood or state rather than actual communication of ideas. He showed me how wrong I was. Over the course of many meetings, he taught me that their vocal range encompassed dozens of distinct sounds, each with particular significance, and that these sounds could be combined in patterns that conveyed complex information. He would make a sound and then demonstrate its meaning through gesture or action. A low, rumbling tone, accompanied by a downward motion of his hand, meant earth or ground or below. A higher pitched sound with an upward gesture meant sky or above or high places. There were sounds for water in its various forms, for different types of trees, for the animals that shared their forest, for weather patterns and seasons and times of day. It was not language, as humans have it, not syntax and grammar in the way I understood those concepts, but it was undeniably a system of communication far more sophisticated than I had imagined possible. I tried to learn these sounds, shaping my throat and mouth to produce approximations of what he made. My efforts were clumsy at first, my human vocal apparatus poorly suited to many of the tones and resonances that came naturally to him. But he was patient in a way that reminded me of the best teachers I had known in my academic life, repeating sounds until I could reproduce them passably, correcting my errors with gentle persistence, celebrating my small successes with that rumbling approval sound I had come to treasure. The vocabulary we built was limited, but functional. I learned to indicate basic needs and observations, to ask simple questions, to express agreement or uncertainty. More importantly, I learned to listen to him with new understanding, recognizing the sounds he made as carriers of specific meaning rather than mere expressions of emotion. Our conversations, if that word can be used for such exchanges, became richer and more nuanced. We were no longer simply two beings sharing space. We were communicating, however imperfectly, across the vast gulf that separated our kinds. Beyond the vocal language, he taught me the grammar of gesture and posture. Their bodies spoke constantly, I came to understand, in ways that were often more eloquent than any sound. The angle of the head, the position of the arms, the way weight was distributed between feet, all of these carried meaning that required careful reading. He would demonstrate postures and then show me the contexts in which they were appropriate, building my understanding of their physical vocabulary piece by patient piece. I learned to recognize the subtle signals that preceded different types of interaction. The way he held himself when he wanted me to follow differed from the stance he adopted when he wanted me to stay. The gesture that invited approach was distinct from the one that requested distance. There were postures of teaching and postures of warning, postures of welcome and postures of dismissal, an entire repertoire of physical communication that I absorbed slowly over many months of careful observation. But the deepest teaching was not about language or gesture. It was about a way of being in the forest that I had never fully achieved despite my years of professional work as a wildlife biologist. He taught me to listen to the world differently, to expand my awareness beyond the narrow focus that human attention tends toward. When we walked through the forest together, he would stop frequently and stand motionless, not because he had seen or heard something specific, but because he was reading the forest as a whole, taking in the sum of all its sounds and movements and silences to form a picture of what was happening across a vast range. I learned to do this myself, though never with his skill. I learned to hear the layered conversation of bird calls and recognize when they were speaking to each other, when they were warning of danger, when they were simply celebrating existence. I learned to feel the slight changes in air pressure that preceded weather, to smell the approach of rain hours before the first drops fell. I learned to notice the subtle signs that indicated where animals had passed, how recently, in what direction, and in what state of alertness or calm. The forest that had seemed like a single entity to me before began to reveal itself as an intricate web of relationships and communications. The trees themselves, I came to understand, were constantly signaling to each other through chemical releases and root networks, warning of threats and sharing resources in ways that science was only beginning to document. The animals moved through this web as participants in an ongoing conversation, their behavior shaped by information flows I had never perceived. And his people, the family I was coming to know, existed at the center of this web, more attuned to its nuances than any creature I had ever observed. He showed me how they tracked weather patterns, reading signs in the behavior of insects, and the movement of clouds that allowed them to predict storms days in advance. He demonstrated the paths they used through the forest, routes that followed natural drainage patterns and avoided areas where the forest floor would betray their passage with noise or tracks. He explained through gesture and sound and patient demonstration the territories of other creatures and how his family navigated among them, maintaining relationships of avoidance with predators and coexistence with the deer and elk and smaller animals that shared their range. I began to move differently through the forest myself. My steps became quieter, more deliberate, placing feet where they would make the least sound. My awareness expanded outward, taking in peripheral movement and distant sounds that I would previously have ignored. I learned to read the forest the way one learns to read a familiar face, recognizing subtle changes in expression that indicated shifts in mood or attention. The grief that had driven me to this forest did not disappear during these months of learning. I do not want to suggest that it was somehow cured by the wonder of what I was experiencing, but it changed. It transformed from something that dominated my existence into something that existed alongside other things, one current in a river that carried many waters. I could feel it still, the absence of Catherine and Emma, the hole in the world where they should have been. But I could also feel other things now. Wonder at the depth of intelligence I was encountering. Gratitude for the patience of this teacher who owed me nothing and gave so much. Purpose in the daily work of learning and observation and relationship. I realized during one of our sessions that months had passed since I had last thought about whether I wanted to continue living. The question had simply become irrelevant, crowded out by the demands and rewards of the life I was actually living. I had come to this forest to escape from a world that had become unbearable. I had found instead a different world, one that asked everything of me and gave back more than I could have imagined. The elder male seemed to sense this change in me, though I could not have said how. There was a warmth in our interactions now that went beyond the careful protocols of early contact. He would sometimes make sounds that seemed like commentary on my progress, observations about how far I had come since those first clumsy attempts at communication. Once, during a pause in one of our lessons, he reached out and placed his massive hand on my shoulder, holding it there for a long moment while his dark eyes met mine. The gesture needed no translation. It was recognition, acceptance, the acknowledgement of a bond that had grown between us. I was changing in ways that would have been invisible to anyone who knew me in my former life. My body had adapted to the physical demands of forest living, growing leaner and stronger despite my age. My senses had sharpened through constant use and attention, but more than this, my mind had expanded into new territories. My understanding of what was possible had been fundamentally altered. and my capacity for patience and presence had deepened in ways that felt like the most important learning of my life. Looking back now across all the years since, I can see that this period of teaching was the foundation upon which everything else was built. The language we developed together, imperfect as it was, allowed for exchanges that would not otherwise have been possible. The way of being in the forest that he taught me allowed me to become truly part of their world, to witness things no human had ever witnessed, to be trusted with knowledge that had never before been shared with someone outside their kind. He was giving me gifts that I did not fully appreciate at the time. Gifts of awareness and attention that would shape the rest of my life regardless of what else happened. He was teaching me, I understand now, not just how to communicate with his people, but how to be present in the world in a way that most humans have forgotten. How to listen to what the earth is saying. How to see what is really there rather than what we expect to see. How to be patient enough to let truth reveal itself in its own time. These were lessons I had not known I needed. They were lessons that answered questions I had not known I was asking, and they were offered freely, with generosity and patience, by a being who owed me nothing and who chose, for reasons I still do not fully understand, to treat me as someone worthy of receiving them. In the quiet of these forest sessions, something in me that had been broken was slowly being remade into a different shape. Not healed exactly, something more like transformed. And for that transformation, I will be grateful until the day I die. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that I could not have imagined when I first arrived at this cabin, broken and emptied by grief. Seasons turned in their ancient cycle, each bringing its own demands and its own gifts, and I moved through them as part of something larger than myself. I was not fully one of them. I understood this and accepted it, but I was no longer entirely separate either. I'd found a place in the margins of their world, a role that was uniquely mine, and in filling that role, I discovered a kind of belonging I had thought lost to me forever. My life organized itself around their patterns rather than any human calendar. I learned the routes of their seasonal movements, the high meadows where they spent the warm months and the sheltered valleys where they retreated when snow began to fall. I adjusted my own rhythms to match theirs, rising and resting according to the light, eating what the forest provided in its various seasons, becoming attuned to the subtle signals that indicated when they would be accessible and when they needed privacy. The human world I had left behind faded to an abstraction, something that existed somewhere beyond the mountains, but that had little relevance to the life I was actually living. The cabin remained my base, the fixed point around which my wanderings circled. I maintained it carefully, replacing shingles when they wore thin, reinforcing walls against the weight of winter snow, keeping the wood stove functioning through years of constant use. But I spent nearly as much time away from it as within it, following the family through their territory, observing their daily lives from the respectful distances I had learned were appropriate, and sometimes, in moments of particular trust, being permitted to join them in ways that still fill me with wonder when I remember them. My role in their family evolved over the years into something I can only describe as that of an odd relative, a peculiar uncle who appeared and disappeared according to his own mysterious patterns, but who was nonetheless recognized and tolerated. The young ones grew up knowing me as a fixture of their world, and this familiarity bred a comfort that their parents had never quite achieved. The adolescents I had first glimpsed from a distance became young adults, and they would sometimes approach me on their own, curious about this strange being who moved through their forest on two legs, but was clearly not dangerous in the way other humans were dangerous. I found ways to be useful to them, contributions I could make that justified my presence in ways beyond simple companionship. During harsh winters when food became scarce, I would leave caches of dried fish and preserved vegetables at locations along their travel routes, supplements to their diet that helped them survive the lean months. When storms damaged their sleeping areas, I sometimes helped with repairs, my human hands capable of manipulating materials in ways their larger fingers could not manage. Once, during a particularly brutal cold snap, I built a fire near their winter shelter, not close enough to be intrusive, but near enough that some of its warmth might reach them. And though they never acknowledged this gift directly, They did not move away from it either. The infant I had first seen cradled in her mother's arms grew into a child and then into a young one who seemed particularly drawn to me. She would follow me at what she thought was a safe distance when I walked through the forest, her curiosity overcoming the caution her parents tried to instill. I pretended not to notice these observations, understanding that she needed to learn about me on her own terms, but I took care to move slowly and make no sudden gestures that might frighten her. Over time, her following became less covert. She would walk openly behind me and eventually beside me, and she learned to make the sounds I had been taught, practicing them with an enthusiasm that sometimes made her father rumble what seemed like paternal amusement. There were losses during these years as well. The elder female, the white-haired matriarch who had watched over the family from her position of quiet authority, grew increasingly frail as the seasons passed. I observed her decline with a sadness that surprised me, feeling grief for someone I had never truly known, whose voice I had never heard up close, who had never acknowledged me with anything more than distant observation. When she finally passed during a spring when the forest was exploding with new life, the family gathered in a way I was not permitted to witness. But I heard them, their voices rising and falling in patterns that could only be mourning, carrying their sorrow across the ridges to where I sat alone and added my own silent grief to theirs. They buried her with rituals I could only partially observe from my distant vantage point. There were sounds I had never heard before, chants or songs that seemed to carry the weight of countless generations. There were gestures that appeared formal and repeated, patterns of movement that spoke of ancient tradition. And there was a procession to a place I was not allowed to follow, a sacred location where their dead were laid to rest in ways that remained hidden from my understanding. The elder male was different after this loss. His mate's mother had been part of their family structure since before I arrived, and her absence seemed to diminish him in ways that went beyond simple grief. He moved more slowly, paused more often during our interactions, seemed to look into distances that I could not see. I recognized this state. I had lived in it myself during those first terrible months after losing Catherine and Emma. I tried to offer what comfort I could through presence and patience, being available without demanding, showing up consistently without expecting anything in return. It was the same gift he had given me years before, and I hoped it might provide some small measure of solace. But life continued, despite loss, as it always does. The family adapted to the elder's absence, redistributing the subtle roles she had filled, adjusting their patterns to account for the wisdom that was no longer there to guide them. The young ones grew and learned and began to take on adult responsibilities. The infant became a child who ran and climbed and played with an energy that seemed to renew the whole family simply by existing. And I watched it all unfold with a gratitude that grew deeper with each passing season. There were moments during these years that I returned to often in memory, small scenes that somehow captured the essence of what this life meant to me. I remember sitting on a hillside one autumn afternoon, the forest blazing with color all around me, and the family emerged from the trees below to forage in a meadow I had not known they used. They did not know I was there, or perhaps they knew and did not care, and I watched them move through the golden light with a grace that made my heart ache with beauty. The mother teaching the young one which plants were good to eat, the adolescents chasing each other in what might have been play or might have been practice for skills they would need as adults. The elder male standing at the edge of the clearing, watching over his family with an attention that I recognized as love in its purest form. I remember a winter night when a storm howled through the mountains, and I huddled in my cabin wondering if they were safe in their shelter miles away. And then, against all expectation, there came a sound outside my door, a vocalization I recognized as the elder male's particular voice. I opened the door to find him standing in the driving snow, and he gestured for me to follow. And I did, struggling through drifts that came to my waist while he broke trail ahead of me with his massive body. He led me to a protected overhang where the family had taken shelter, and they made room for me among them, their collective warmth keeping the cold at bay through that long and brutal night. I remember the first time the young one I had watched grow from infancy reached out and touched my hand deliberately. her small fingers exploring the strange smoothness of my skin with a curiosity that was entirely innocent. Her mother made a sound of mild warning, but the elder male made a different sound that seemed to say, "Let her learn." And so I sat motionless while this child of another species conducted her investigation of what I was. When she was finished, she looked up at me and made a sound that I recognized as the one they used for family, or belong, or one of us. And though I knew she was using it loosely, experimenting with language the way children do, it meant more to me than I could possibly express. These years were not easy in any conventional sense. The physical demands of forest life were constant and sometimes brutal. There were injuries and illnesses that I had to treat with nothing but the supplies I had brought and the healing plants the elder male showed me how to use. There were stretches of loneliness when I did not see them for weeks and wondered if our relationship had somehow ended without my understanding why. There were moments when I missed human conversation so deeply that I would speak aloud to myself just to hear the sound of words. But there was also richness beyond anything I had known in my previous life. There was the profound satisfaction of belonging somewhere, of having a role and a purpose in relationships that mattered. There was the constant wonder of learning, of discovering new things about a form of life that no scientist had ever studied, that existed beyond the boundaries of what the human world considered possible. There was the simple joy of being present in one of the last truly wild places on Earth, surrounded by ancient trees and clean water and air that tasted of nothing but itself. And there was love. I use that word carefully, knowing how strange it might sound. But I do not know what else to call what I felt for these beings who had taken me in and allowed me to share their lives. The elder male who had become my teacher and my friend. His mate who had gradually softened her wariness into something like acceptance. The young ones who had grown up with me as a familiar presence, neither one of them nor quite other. The child who reached out and touched my hand and called me one of us. I loved them. I loved them with a fullness that surprised me, that healed something in me I had thought permanently broken. They became my family in the truest sense of the word. Not a replacement for what I had lost, for nothing could ever replace Catherine and Emma. But something new, something that existed alongside the memory of what had been, something that proved the heart's capacity for connection is larger than we imagine. In those years of belonging, I learned that family is not defined by blood or species, but by the choice to care for others and the willingness to let them care for you in return. Looking back across all those years of shared existence, I find myself returning again and again to the question of what they taught me. Not the practical lessons, though those were valuable beyond measure, but the deeper wisdom that emerged from living alongside beings who understood the world so differently than humans do. They changed me in ways that went far beyond knowledge, reshaping the very foundations of how I perceived existence itself. The first and perhaps most profound teaching was about presence. Human beings, I came to understand, live most of our lives somewhere other than where we actually are. We dwell in memories of the past or anxieties about the future, in abstractions and plans and regrets that pull our attention away from the immediate moment. We have constructed entire civilizations around this capacity for mental time travel, building systems and structures based on what was and what might be, rather than what simply is. And while this ability has given us remarkable powers, it has also cost us something essential. They did not live this way. Their awareness was rooted in the present moment with an intensity that I had never encountered in any human being, including the most disciplined practitioners of meditation I had known. When the elder male looked at me, he was fully looking at me, not thinking about our last interaction or planning our next one, but completely present to whatever was happening in that precise instant. When they moved through the forest, they were entirely there, every sense engaged with the reality around them, responsive to the constant flow of information that the natural world provides. This presence was not passive or empty. It was vibrant with attention, alive to every detail, capable of a depth of perception that our scattered human minds rarely achieve. They noticed things that I walked past without seeing, heard sounds that my ears registered as mere background noise, sensed changes in their environment that I could only detect once they pointed them out. Their experience of the world was richer and more textured than mine, not because their senses were necessarily better, but because their attention was so much more fully committed. I learned to practice this presence myself, to quiet the constant chatter of my mind and simply be where I was. It was the hardest discipline I have ever undertaken, requiring years of effort before I could maintain it for more than a few moments at a time. But as the capacity grew in me, I began to understand what I had been missing all my life. The world revealed itself to be infinitely more detailed and alive than I had ever perceived. Colors became more vivid, sounds more distinct. The simple act of breathing became a source of wonder. I was not becoming more like them, that was impossible, but I was becoming more fully human in a way that most humans never achieve. The second great teaching was about relationship. Human society is built largely on transactions, exchanges of goods and services, and status that are tallied and balanced and tracked. Even our closest relationships often carry implicit ledgers, accounting of who is given what and who is owed what in return. We love conditionally, care strategically, maintain relationships that serve our interests, and allow others to fade when they no longer provide benefit. They did not seem to operate this way. The bonds within the family were absolute, unconditional, maintained not because of what any individual provided, but simply because of who they were. The elder male cared for his mate without calculation, protected his young without expectation of return, accepted the burdens of leadership without seeking recognition or reward. When the elder female grew frail and needed constant attendance, the family provided it without any apparent consideration of cost or benefit. She was one of them. That was enough. I felt this unconditional regard extended to me as well, once I had been accepted into their circle. They did not keep track of the gifts I brought or the services I provided. They did not weigh my contributions against my intrusions and decide whether I was worth tolerating. Once the decision had been made to include me, I was simply included, as completely and unreservedly as any member of the family. The gifts I gave were received with gratitude, but not tallied. The mistakes I made were corrected without resentment. I was accepted as I was, with all my human limitations and strangeness, and that acceptance was not contingent on anything I might do or fail to do. This experience of unconditional belonging was healing in ways I did not fully understand at the time. I had spent my life, like most humans, performing for acceptance, adjusting my behavior to meet expectations, worrying about how I was perceived and whether I was measuring up. Among them, this anxiety gradually dissolved. There was no performance required, no standard to meet, no possibility of being cast out for inadequacy. I simply was, and that was enough. The third teaching was about the relationship between individual and world. Humans tend to experience ourselves as separate from the environment around us, as beings who move through a world that is fundamentally other, a backdrop against which our individual dramas play out. We use the natural world as resource and setting, but we rarely experience ourselves as part of it in any essential way. They had no such separation. They were the forest, and the forest was them, in a way that I struggle to articulate because human language is built around the assumption of subject and object, self and other. They did not merely live in the forest, they participated in it, existed as nodes in a vast web of relationships that included every tree and stream and creature. Their movements were not just travel from one place to another, but continuous dialogue with the land they moved through. Their eating was not consumption of resources, but participation in cycles of growth and decay that included their own bodies as fully as the berries they picked and the fish they caught. I began to feel this connectivity myself as the years passed. The boundary between where I ended and the forest began grew increasingly permeable. I stopped thinking of the trees as separate objects and started experiencing them as presences with their own kind of awareness. The creek became not just water flowing past, but a living entity whose voice carried meaning I was gradually learning to hear. The elk and deer and birds became not wildlife I observed, but neighbors in a community I was part of, fellow participants in the same great dance of existence. This shift in perception was subtle and gradual, unfolding over years rather than arriving in any moment of sudden enlightenment. But its effect was profound. The loneliness that had haunted me since the deaths of Catherine and Emma began to dissolve as I realized that I was never actually alone. I was held within a web of relationship that extended far beyond human connection, sustained by bonds that most of my species had forgotten how to perceive. The forest was my family too. The mountains and streams and ancient trees were my kin. I belonged to something much larger than myself, and that belonging was unbreakable because it was not dependent on any individual relationship that could be lost. The fourth teaching was about time. Humans experience time as a linear progression, a sequence of moments leading from past toward future, with the present as a thin and fleeting boundary between what was and what will be. We organize our lives around this linear framework, measuring and managing and planning according to schedules that we impose on the natural flow of existence. They experience time differently, though I cannot say exactly how, because the concepts required to describe their experience do not exist in human language. Time for them seemed more cyclical than linear, organized around recurring patterns rather than progressive sequences. The seasons turned in their eternal wheel. The days flowed through their predictable rhythm of light and darkness. The generations rose and fell like waves on a shore, each individual arising from what came before and passing into what would come after, none of them singular or isolated, but all of them part of an ongoing pattern that had no real beginning or end. Living among them, I began to experience time this way myself. The urgency that had characterized my human life gradually released its grip. There was nowhere to get to, nothing that had to be accomplished by any particular deadline, no future state that would be better than the present, if only I could reach it quickly enough. There was only the turning of the seasons and the daily rhythm of light and dark, and the great slow pulse of existence that has been beating since the beginning of life on Earth. This teaching about time was perhaps the most healing of all for my grief. Human mourning is so often about the future that will never be, the years with Catherine and Emma that were stolen from me, the events and milestones and shared experiences that I will never have. But when time became cyclical rather than linear, this loss changed its nature. Catherine and Emma were not gone into a past that was receding further away with each passing day. They were part of the great pattern, woven into the fabric of existence, present in ways that my linear thinking had made me unable to perceive. I do not mean to suggest that grief disappeared or that I stopped missing them. I missed them every day, and I miss them still. But the missing changed from sharp and desperate to soft and sweet, a gentle ache rather than a tearing wound. They were not lost. They were simply in a different part of the pattern, a part I could not see but that was no less real for being invisible to me. The elder male seemed to understand this transformation in me. There were times, especially as we both grew older together, when he would look at me with an expression that I can only describe as recognition. He too had lost ones he loved. He too carried the weight of absence alongside the weight of presence. And he too, I came to understand, had found a way to hold both without being broken by either. The pattern held all of it, the joy and the sorrow, the presence and the absence, the births and the deaths. Nothing was truly lost because nothing was truly separate to begin with. These teachings were never spoken in words. They could not have been, even if we had shared a language. They were transmitted through presence and example and the slow accumulation of shared experience. I absorbed them the way a plant absorbs sunlight, without intention or effort, simply by being present and open and willing to receive what was offered. And in receiving them, I became something different than I had been when I first stumbled into this forest, carrying a burden of grief I did not think I could survive. I will not say that they saved my life, though in a literal sense, they probably did. What I will say is that they showed me a way of living that I had not known existed. They demonstrated that there are ways of being in the world that are older and wiser than anything human civilization has developed. They proved that connection across the gulf of species is possible, that love can bridge distances that seem unbridgeable, that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we allow ourselves to believe. For these gifts, I remain eternally grateful. For these teachings, I have tried to live a life worthy of receiving them, and for the beings who offered them so freely, I carry a love that will not end until I draw my last breath, and perhaps not even then. The changes came so gradually that I did not recognize them at first for what they were. A distant rumble that might have been thunder but repeated too regularly. A faint smell on certain days that did not belong to the forest I had come to know so intimately. Trails that seemed slightly wider than I remembered. The brush along their edges disturbed in ways that suggested passage by something other than animals. For a long time, I absorbed these signs without truly seeing them, the way one absorbs the slow aging of a familiar face without noticing the accumulation of years. It was the elder male who first showed me that these changes were significant. During one of our meetings in the meadow where we had first truly seen each other, he made sounds I had not heard before and gestured toward the ridgeline to the south. His posture held a tension I had learned to read as concern, and his dark eyes carried a weight that seemed heavier than usual. He pointed again toward the ridge and made a sound that I knew meant human or people like you. And then he made another sound that meant many or growing. I climbed to a high point that afternoon, a rocky outcrop that offered views across miles of forest, and I looked in the direction he had indicated. What I saw made my heart sink. On the distant slopes, perhaps 15 miles from where I stood, the green fabric of old growth had been torn. Raw patches of brown earth showed where trees had been felled, roads carved pale lines through the forest like fresh wounds, and rising above it all, plumes of dust that spoke of machinery at work, of progress advancing, of the human world reaching toward the sanctuary that had sheltered us. In the weeks that followed, I began to pay attention to the changes in ways I had not before. Hiking to the edges of the territory I knew, I found new logging roads where there had been none. I heard the whine of chainsaws on days when the wind blew from certain directions. I encountered survey markers and flagging tape and other signs that the forest I had called home was being measured and evaluated and prepared for uses that would transform it utterly. The family felt these changes more acutely than I did. Their senses were keener, their attunement to the forest more complete, and disturbances that I barely noticed registered to them as loud disruptions in the fabric of their world. They began to modify their patterns, avoiding areas they had previously used freely, traveling further to reach resources that had once been close at hand. The easy rhythm of their seasonal movements became more cautious, more calculated, informed by a vigilance that had not been necessary in all the years I had known them. The elder male showed me the evidence of what was happening through a series of excursions to the boundaries of their range. He pointed out the places where human activity had already encroached, old growth stands that had been clear-cut, streams that ran muddy with erosion from logging roads, meadows where the sound of machinery made wildlife flee. Each of these expeditions felt like a lesson in loss, a tour of what was being taken from them piece by piece. I understood his purpose in showing me these things. He wanted me to know what was at stake. He wanted me to understand why the changes I had noticed were not minor inconveniences, but existential threats. His people had survived for countless generations by remaining hidden in the deep wilderness where humans did not venture. As that wilderness shrank, as the accessible areas expanded and the truly remote places diminished, the space available to them contracted like a closing fist. The young ones felt the tension most acutely. They had grown up in a world of relative safety, accustomed to moving freely through a territory that felt secure. Now, they watched their parents become increasingly cautious, heard the strange sounds that drifted in from the forest edges, sensed the anxiety that pervaded the family's interactions without fully understanding its source. The playfulness that had characterized their youth became tempered with a wariness that made me ache to witness. The child who had been born during my time with them was old enough now to understand that something was wrong, though too young to comprehend what it meant. She would ask questions in the vocabulary we shared, using sounds that meant why and what, and her gesture for afraid. Her parents answered as best they could, but some truths are too large to communicate even in a shared language, and the truth of what was happening was larger than any of us could hold. I tried to help in the ways available to me. I scouted the advancing edges of human activity and reported back to the elder male through our system of signs and sounds. I identified areas that remained relatively undisturbed and might serve as refuges. I mapped in my mind the routes that would allow the family to move without crossing paths with logging crews or hikers, or the increasing number of recreational visitors who were penetrating further into the backcountry each season. But I also knew that my help was limited, and that the fundamental problem was beyond my power to solve. The forces driving the changes were vast and impersonal, economic and political and demographic pressures that no individual could resist. The population of the region was growing. Demand for timber was rising. Technology was making it possible to reach areas that had once been too remote to exploit profitably. The wilderness was being converted into resources, commodities, experiences to be consumed, and there was nothing I could do to stop this conversion. There were seasons during this time when the family barely saw me, retreating into the most inaccessible corners of their range to avoid the increasing human presence. I would wait at our usual meeting places, and they would not come. I would make the calls the elder male had taught me and hear no response. These absences were not rejections of me specifically, but responses to a threat that made all human contact more dangerous. I understood this and did not take offense, but the loneliness of those seasons cut deeply after so many years of belonging. When they did appear, our interactions had a different quality than before. There was an urgency now, a seriousness that had not characterized our earlier years together. The elder male would communicate information about what he had observed, asking me in his way to explain the patterns of human behavior he did not understand. Why were they cutting the trees? Where would they cut next? Would the destruction ever stop? These were questions I could not answer honestly without conveying a truth that seemed too cruel to speak. The hardest moments came when I encountered evidence of near misses, places where the family had clearly been forced to flee on short notice from approaching humans, abandoned sleeping areas with the moss still pressed down from their bodies, half-eaten food left behind in sudden departures. Once, a child's toy, a small carved figure I recognized as belonging to the young one, dropped in haste and never retrieved. I gathered these remnants when I found them, hiding them in places where they would not be discovered, erasing the signs of presence that might draw unwanted attention. I began to feel the weight of my own species pressing down on me. I was one of them, one of the humans whose expansion was threatening everything I had come to love. My presence in this forest, however gentle and respectful I had tried to make it, was itself a kind of intrusion. I ate fish from their streams and gathered plants from their territory and left footprints and traces that added to the accumulated human pressure. The guilt of this realization was a new kind of pain, different from grief, but no less sharp. The elder male seemed to sense my internal conflict. During one of our meetings, when I had been unable to hide my distress at the latest evidence of encroachment I had witnessed, he placed his hand on my shoulder and made sounds that I interpreted as comfort or understanding. He did not blame me for what my kind was doing. He seemed to recognize that I was as caught in these forces as he was, powerless to stop what was happening, able only to witness and to grieve. This period taught me something about loss that even the deaths of Catherine and Emma had not fully conveyed. There are losses that are sudden and complete, wounds that open in an instant and leave you changed forever. But there are also losses that unfold slowly, that accrue incrementally over time, that you can see coming but cannot prevent. The second kind of loss is in some ways harder because it carries the additional burden of anticipation, the weight of knowing that each day brings you closer to an ending you cannot avoid. I watched the family adapt and endure, finding new routes and new refuges, adjusting their patterns to accommodate the shrinking space available to them. Their resilience was remarkable, born of generations of survival in a world that had never been easy. But I could see the cost this adaptation extracted, the stress it placed on relationships and health, and the simple joy of existence. They were surviving, but they were no longer thriving. And the distinction mattered more than I would have thought possible. The forest I had come to love was changing around me, and the beings I had been privileged to know were being squeezed by forces that did not even know they existed. I could not stop what was happening. I could only witness it and help where I could and prepare myself for whatever ending this slow tragedy was building toward. The years of belonging that had healed me were giving way to a new chapter, and I did not know what that chapter would hold.